The orange glow on the horizon told Grace Nichols that everything she had ever known was burning to ash, and she could do nothing but watch from the ridge where her horse had thrown her an hour before. She pressed her hand against her ribs where the fall had knocked the wind from her lungs and felt the sharp ache that reminded her she was still alive, even if her world was ending. The September wind carried smoke and the distant sound of timber cracking, and she knew without seeing that the house Samuel had built with his own hands 7 years ago was gone. The barn where they had stored the winter hay, the chicken coop, the small vegetable garden she had tended every morning before the sun rose too high. All of it disappearing into flame and smoke on this autumn evening in 1877. Her husband had been dead 3 months when the fire started. Cholera had taken Samuel Nichols in June, along with 4 other men in South Pass City, Wyoming, and Grace had been struggling to keep the ranch running alone ever since. She was 24 years old and had never imagined she would be a widow before her 25th birthday. Samuel had been 29, strong and healthy one day, gone the next. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done, but Grace still wondered if she had missed some sign, some moment where she could have saved him. Now even his memory was burning. Grace finally managed to catch her mare as darkness fell, her hands shaking as she gripped the reins. The horse was still spooked, eyes rolling white in the firelight that painted the sky red. Grace pulled herself into the saddle despite the pain in her ribs and rode slowly down the ridge toward what remained of her life. She had been in town buying supplies when the fire started. Someone said they had seen lightning strike near her property that afternoon, and Grace had dropped her parcels and run for her horse. But she had been too late. By the time she had ridden halfway home, the smoke was already visible. The ranch house was a smoking skeleton when she reached it. The walls had collapsed inward, and small flames still licked at the remaining timbers. The barn was completely gone, reduced to a field of glowing embers. Grace dismounted carefully and stood in the yard where she had swept the porch steps just that morning, and felt something inside her break that had nothing to do with her bruised ribs. She had no family left. Her parents had died in a wagon accident when she was 16, and Samuel had been an only child like herself. The ranch had been their dream, their future, the place where they had planned to raise children and grow old together. Now it was ash and ruin, and Grace had nothing. Not even a place to sleep tonight. She stood there until the moon rose, her face streaked with tears and soot, and wondered what she was supposed to do next. When dawn came, Grace was sitting on a flat rock near the creek, wrapped in the wool coat she kept tied behind her saddle. She had not slept. Her eyes burned and her throat was raw from breathing smoke, and she could not stop staring at the ruins of her home. The September morning was cold, and Grace shivered despite the coat. She knew she should ride into South Pass City and find somewhere to stay, but she could not make herself move. This land was all she had left of Samuel. If she left, it felt like giving up on him entirely. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. A rider was approaching from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. Grace stood slowly, wincing at the pain in her side, and shaded her eyes to see who was coming. As the rider drew closer, she recognized Ethan Cole, a rancher who owned property about 5 miles north of her land. She had met him a handful of times in town, though they had never spoken more than polite greetings. He was a quiet man, tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and serious gray eyes. Ethan reined in his horse and dismounted, his gaze moving from Grace to the smoking ruins behind her. His expression was grave. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, a gesture of respect that made Grace's throat tighten. "Mrs. Nichols," he said, his voice low and rough. I saw the smoke from my property yesterday evening. I rode over to see if I could help, but by the time I got here, the fire was too far gone. I have been looking for you since dawn." Grace tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I was in town when it started. My horse threw me on the way back. I could not get here in time." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Are you hurt?" "My ribs are bruised, I think. Nothing serious." She gestured helplessly at the ruins. "Everything is gone. The house, the barn, all the supplies I had stored for winter. I do not know what I am going to do." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, "You cannot stay here. There is nothing left. You need shelter and food, and you need someone to look at those ribs." "I know," Grace said, and she heard the exhaustion in her own voice. "I will go into town and see if the boarding house has a room available. I have a little money saved. Enough for a few weeks, maybe." "And then what?" Ethan asked, not unkindly. Grace had no answer. She had been asking herself the same question all night. Ethan looked at her for another moment, then at the ruins, then back at her. Something shifted in his expression, like he was making a decision that surprised even himself. "Come to my ranch," he said. "I have a spare room. You can stay there until you figure out what you want to do next." Grace stared at him. "I could not possibly impose on you like that." "It is not an imposition," Ethan said. "You need help, and I have the means to give it. That is all there is to it." "People will talk," Grace said quietly. A widow staying at a bachelor's ranch. Ethan's expression did not change. "People talk regardless of what we do. If you are worried about your reputation, I can sleep in the barn. But you are not spending another night out here in the cold with broken ribs and nowhere to go." Grace wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too hurt and too grief-stricken to find the words. And the truth was, she had no better options. The boarding house in South Pass City was expensive, and she did not know how long her small savings would last. She had no skills beyond running a ranch, and there were not many jobs available for women in a mining town like South Pass City. Ethan's offer, strange as it was, might be the only lifeline she had. "All right," she said finally, "but only until I can find something more permanent. I will not be a burden to you." "You are not a burden," Ethan said. He put his hat back on and moved toward his horse. "Can you ride? Or should I tie your mare to mine and have you ride with me?" Grace's pride bristled at the suggestion, but when she tried to mount her mare, the pain in her ribs made her gasp. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his hand steadying her elbow. His touch was gentle but firm, and Grace felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with pain. "Ride with me," Ethan said quietly. "There is no shame in accepting help when you need it." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Ethan tied her mare to his saddle, then helped her mount behind him. She hesitated before putting her arms around his waist, but there was no other way to stay on the horse. Ethan did not seem bothered by the closeness. He simply clicked his tongue and urged his horse into a steady walk, heading north toward his ranch. They rode in silence. Grace rested her cheek against Ethan's back, too exhausted to care about propriety anymore. His coat smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something else she could not quite name. It was strange to be this close to a man who was not Samuel, but she was too numb to feel guilty about it. She just felt empty. Ethan's ranch came into view after about an hour of riding. It was a modest spread, with a sturdy two-story house, a large barn, and several corrals. Grace could see cattle grazing in the distance and a few chickens scratching in the yard. It was not a large operation, but it was well maintained and clearly successful. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Grace felt a pang of longing for the simple comfort of a warm fire and a safe place to rest. Ethan helped her down from the horse and led her inside. The house was neat and sparsely furnished, with a practical layout that spoke of a man who lived alone and kept things simple. There was a large fireplace in the main room, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and a few shelves lined with books. Ethan gestured toward a door on the far wall. "That is the spare room," he said. "It is not much, but the bed is clean and the roof does not leak. You can rest there as long as you need." Grace looked at the door, then at Ethan. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You barely know me." Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, Grace saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Because someone should," he said simply. "And because I know what it is like to lose everything and have no one to turn to." Grace wanted to ask what he meant, but Ethan had already turned away, moving toward the kitchen. "I will make you something to eat," he said. "And then you should rest. We can talk about everything else later." Grace went into the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed. The room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the fields and a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She lay down slowly, every movement sending sharp pains through her ribs, and stared at the ceiling. She had not cried since the night before, but now the tears came again, hot and silent, soaking into the pillow. She cried for Samuel, for the life they had lost, for the future that would never happen. She cried for the home that was gone, for the loneliness that stretched out before her like an endless road. And she cried because a stranger had shown her more kindness in one morning than she had felt since her husband died, and she did not know how to bear that kind of generosity. Eventually, exhaustion won out over grief, and Grace fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the sun was setting and the room was filled with soft orange light. Grace sat up carefully, testing her ribs. They still hurt, but the pain was duller now, more manageable. She could hear sounds from the main room, the clatter of dishes and the crackle of the fire. She stood and walked to the door, opening it to find Ethan setting the table for dinner. He looked up when she entered. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Grace said. "I am sorry. I did not mean to sleep the whole day." "You needed it," Ethan said. He gestured to the table. "Sit down. Dinner is ready." Grace sat, and Ethan placed a plate in front of her. It was simple fare, beans and cornbread and a piece of fried ham, but it smelled delicious. Grace realized she had not eaten since yesterday morning in town, and her stomach growled audibly. Ethan smiled slightly, the first real expression she had seen on his face, and Grace felt that strange flutter in her chest again. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ethan said, "I rode back to your property this afternoon while you were sleeping. I wanted to see if anything could be salvaged." Grace looked up sharply. "Was there anything?" Ethan shook his head. "I am sorry. The fire burned too hot. Everything is gone." Grace set down her fork, her appetite suddenly vanished. "I see." "There is something else," Ethan said carefully. "I checked the property lines while I was there. Your land borders mine on the southern edge. If you wanted to sell, I would be willing to buy it from you. It would give you enough money to start over somewhere else if that is what you want." Grace stared at him. "You would buy my land if you wanted to sell," Ethan said. "I am not trying to take advantage of your situation. I just thought it might help to have options." Grace looked down at her plate. The idea of selling the land felt like a betrayal of Samuel, but what else could she do? She could not rebuild the ranch alone, and she had no money to hire help. Selling might be the only practical choice. "I will think about it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded and did not press the issue. They finished dinner in silence, and then Ethan helped Grace wash the dishes. It was a strangely domestic scene, and Grace felt a pang of grief for all the evenings she and Samuel had done the same thing, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Over the next few days, Grace settled into a routine at Ethan's ranch. She was not the kind of woman who could sit idle, so despite Ethan's protests, she began helping around the house. She cooked meals and mended clothes and tended to the chickens. Her ribs healed slowly, and with each passing day she felt a little stronger. Ethan was a quiet presence, but not an uncomfortable one. He worked long hours on the ranch, caring for his cattle and maintaining his property, but he always made time to check on Grace and make sure she had everything she needed. He was kind without being overbearing, respectful without being distant. Grace found herself looking forward to the evenings when they would sit by the fire and talk about small things, the weather and the livestock and the gossip from town. She learned that Ethan had come to Wyoming 5 years ago from Missouri, where his family had lost their farm in a bank foreclosure. His parents had died shortly after, and Ethan had headed west with nothing but a horse and a determination to build something of his own. He had worked as a ranch hand for 3 years, saving every penny, until he had enough to buy this land and start his own operation. He had been alone ever since, focused entirely on making the ranch successful. "I never had time for anything else," he told Grace one evening as they sat by the fire. "Building this place took everything I had. I always told myself I would think about the future once the ranch was stable, but then the years just kept passing." Grace understood what he meant. She and Samuel had been the same way, so focused on survival and success that they had kept putting off the things they wanted. They had always said they would start a family once the ranch was more established, once they had more money saved, once the house was bigger. But Samuel had died before any of that could happen, and now Grace would never have the chance to be a mother. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Spending all your time on the ranch." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "it is a lonely life. But I did not see another choice. After my family lost everything, I swore I would never be in that position again. I wanted to build something that could not be taken away." "But everything can be taken away," Grace said, and she heard the bitterness in her own voice. "Fire, illness, bad luck. None of us are as safe as we think we are." Ethan looked at her, and there was understanding in his eyes. "You are right," he said. "I suppose the only thing we can do is make the most of what we have while we have it." Grace nodded, and they fell into silence again. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from two people who understand each other's pain. As the weeks passed, Grace found herself thinking less about the past and more about the present. She still missed Samuel terribly, and there were moments when the grief would hit her like a physical blow. But those moments were coming less frequently now, and in between them, she was discovering a strange kind of peace. Part of that peace came from the work. Grace had always been happiest when she had something to do, and there was plenty of work on Ethan's ranch. She took over most of the cooking and household chores, freeing up Ethan to focus on the livestock and the land. She also started helping with some of the outdoor work, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, and even helping Ethan mend fences when her ribs were fully healed. But part of the peace also came from Ethan himself. He was easy to be around, steady and calm and thoughtful. He never pushed her to talk about Samuel or the fire, but he was always there if she needed someone to listen. And slowly, almost without Grace realizing it, their relationship began to shift from something polite and careful into something deeper. It started with small things. The way Ethan would smile when Grace made his favorite meal. The way Grace would find herself watching Ethan work in the fields, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the determined set of his jaw. The way their hands would brush when they passed dishes at the dinner table, and neither of them would pull away quite as quickly as they should. Grace tried to ignore the growing attraction, telling herself it was too soon, that she was still mourning Samuel, that it would be wrong to feel this way about another man. But the truth was, she had been mourning Samuel for months before he died, watching him waste away from cholera and knowing there was nothing she could do. And now she was tired of grief. She was tired of being alone. She wanted to feel something other than sadness for once. One evening in late October, Grace was preparing dinner when Ethan came in from the fields earlier than usual. His expression was troubled, and Grace immediately set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "What is wrong?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then said, "There is a man in town asking questions about you." Grace felt her stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "He claims to be Samuel's cousin. He says he has a legal claim to your land because Samuel had no will, and as the only living relative, he is entitled to the property." Grace stared at him. "Samuel did not have any cousins. He told me he had no family left." "That is what I thought too," Ethan said, "but this man has documents." He showed them to the sheriff. "I do not know if they are legitimate or not, but he is making a lot of noise and people are listening." Grace sank into a chair, her mind racing. She had never thought about legal issues surrounding the land. After Samuel died, she had simply assumed the property was hers. But if this man had documents, if he could prove some kind of claim, then she might lose the land entirely. And if she lost the land, she would have nothing at all. "What should I do?" she asked, hating the fear in her own voice. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "We need to talk to a lawyer, find out what your legal rights are, but Grace, there is something else you should know." "What?" Ethan took a deep breath. "If you were married to someone with a legal claim to the land, this man would have no case. A husband's claim would supersede a cousin's claim, especially a cousin whose relationship to Samuel is questionable at best." Grace looked at him, not understanding at first. Then the meaning of his words sank in and her eyes widened. "Are you suggesting that I marry someone just to protect the land?" "I am suggesting that you marry me," Ethan said quietly. Grace felt like the world had tilted sideways. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan continued, his voice steady but his eyes intense. "I know this is not romantic, and I know it is not what either of us imagined. But the truth is, Grace, I care about you. These past weeks, having you here, it has been the happiest I have been in years. I am not asking you to love me. I am just asking you to let me protect you. Let me give you my name so that no one can take your land or leave you with nothing. And maybe, in time, we could build something real together." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She thought about Samuel, about the life they had planned, about the promises they had made. But Samuel was gone, and Grace was still here, and she had to find a way to survive. She also thought about Ethan, about the way he had taken her in without hesitation, about the kindness in his eyes and the quiet strength in his presence, about the way she had started to feel safe again, maybe even happy, in the weeks she had spent at his ranch. "This is insane," she whispered. "Maybe," Ethan agreed, "but that does not mean it is wrong." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "If I agree to this, I want you to know that I do care about you, Ethan. I did not expect to, but I do. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect, and I would be proud to be your wife. But I cannot promise that I am ready to love you the way a wife should love a husband. Not yet." "I am not asking for promises," Ethan said. "I am just asking for a chance." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She reached across the table and took Ethan's hand, and he squeezed her fingers gently. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." Ethan's face broke into a genuine smile, the first real one Grace had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire expression. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Thank you," he said. "I promise I will do everything I can to make you happy." "I know you will," Grace said, and she realized that she meant it. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in South Pass City. The preacher was surprised by the sudden wedding, but he did not ask too many questions. Grace wore the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that she had managed to save from the fire because she had been wearing it in town that day. Ethan wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, and he looked nervous and hopeful in equal measure. There were no guests at the wedding except for the preacher's wife, who served as a witness, and the sheriff, who Ethan had asked to attend to make sure the marriage was properly documented. The sheriff was a gruff man in his 50s named Tom Winters, and he shook Ethan's hand after the ceremony and told Grace that she had chosen a good man. "That cousin of your late husband's will not be able to touch you now," Sheriff Winters said. "And between you and me, I think his documents were forgeries anyway. But this is better. No one can question your claim to the land now." Grace thanked him, and then she and Ethan rode back to the ranch together. It was strange to think that she was now Grace Cole, that the name she had carried for 7 years was gone, replaced by something new. But as Ethan helped her down from her horse and smiled at her with such genuine warmth, Grace felt something in her chest loosen. Maybe this was not the life she had planned, but maybe it could still be a good life. That night, Ethan made dinner while Grace sat by the fire, exhausted from the emotions of the day. When he brought her a plate, she looked up at him and said, "You do not have to sleep in the barn anymore. We are married now." Ethan sat down next to her. "Grace, I meant what I said. I am not expecting anything from you that you are not ready to give. If you want me to keep the spare room, I will." Grace shook her head. "I do not want that. I do not want this to be a marriage in name only. I want to try to build something real with you. But I need time, Ethan. I need to be sure that what I am feeling is real and not just gratitude or fear of being alone." "Take all the time you need," Ethan said. "I am not going anywhere." Grace smiled, and then, on impulse, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and brief, but it was real. When she pulled back, Ethan's eyes were wide with surprise. "That is a start," Grace said softly. "That is a very good start," Ethan agreed, and he took her hand and held it as they finished their dinner. The next few weeks were an adjustment. Grace moved her few belongings into Ethan's room, and they began sharing a bed. At first they stayed on their separate sides, careful not to crowd each other. But gradually, they grew more comfortable. Grace would wake in the morning to find Ethan's arm draped over her waist, or she would fall asleep with her head on his shoulder. They kissed more often, slow and sweet, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Grace found herself thinking about Ethan constantly. The way he laughed at her jokes, rare as his laughter was. The way he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. The way he looked at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. It was different from what she had felt for Samuel, but it was no less powerful. One cold November evening, as they lay in bed together, Grace finally told Ethan about Samuel's death. She had not been able to talk about it before, but now, with Ethan's arms around her and his steady heartbeat beneath her ear, the words came tumbling out. "He was sick for almost 2 weeks," she said. "At first we thought it was just a stomach ailment, something that would pass. But then he started getting worse. The fever, the dehydration. By the time we realized it was cholera, it was too late. I sat with him every day, trying to get him to drink water, trying to keep him cool, but nothing worked. He died on a Tuesday morning, and his last words were an apology. He said he was sorry for leaving me alone." Ethan tightened his arms around her. "I am so sorry, Grace." "I was angry at him for a long time," Grace admitted. "I know that is terrible, but I was. Angry that he left me, angry that he did not fight harder, angry that he apologized instead of telling me he loved me. But I think I understand now. He was scared. We were both scared. You are allowed to be angry, Ethan said. Grief is not just sadness, it is everything all at once. Grace nodded against his chest. I think I am finally ready to let go of the anger. I will always love Samuel. He was my first love and he gave me 7 good years. But he is gone and I am still here and I need to live my life. I need to be happy again. Are you happy? Ethan asked quietly. Grace pulled back so she could look at him. His gray eyes were searching hers, vulnerable and hopeful. She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. Yes, she said. I am happy. You make me happy, Ethan. Ethan's expression softened and he kissed her, deeper this time with more passion. Grace responded, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. And for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt whole again. They made love that night, slow and tender, and Grace cried afterward, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of healing, of new beginnings. Ethan held her through it all, whispering reassurances and kissing her forehead, and Grace knew that she had made the right choice. This was where she was meant to be. Winter came early that year, and by mid-December, South Pass City was blanketed in snow. Grace and Ethan settled into the rhythms of married life, working side by side during the day and curling up together by the fire at night. Grace found herself laughing more, smiling more, feeling more like herself than she had in months. She also started talking about the future. One evening, as they sat together planning the spring planting, Grace said, I think we should rebuild on my land, the house and the barn. We could expand the ranch, run both properties as one operation. Ethan looked up from the map they had been studying. Are you sure? I thought you wanted to sell that land. I thought I did, Grace said. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that land is part of my story. Samuel and I built something there, even if it is gone now. I do not want to just walk away from that. I want to build something new there, something that honors the past but looks toward the future. With you. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. Then that is what we will do. We will start rebuilding in the spring. Grace smiled and then she said, There is something else I want. What is that? I want children, Grace said, her voice soft but certain. I always wanted to be a mother. Samuel and I were going to start a family, but we kept putting it off, and then it was too late. I do not want to make that mistake again. Life is too short and too uncertain. If we want something, we should reach for it now. Ethan's eyes lit up. I want that too, he said. I have always wanted children. I just never thought I would have the chance. Well, now you do, Grace said, smiling. Now we both do. They spent the rest of the winter dreaming and planning. They talked about the house they would build, bigger than the one Grace had lost, with enough rooms for a growing family. They talked about the life they would create, the traditions they would start, the legacy they would leave. And they loved each other with an intensity that surprised them both, making up for all the lonely years they had spent apart. Spring arrived in late March, bringing warmer weather and new hope. Ethan hired a crew to start clearing the ruins on Grace's land and laying the foundation for the new house. Grace threw herself into the work, helping wherever she could and making sure every detail was exactly right. She wanted this house to be a symbol of resilience, proof that they could overcome anything as long as they had each other. By June, the house was taking shape. It was a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and large windows that let in plenty of light. Grace had insisted on a big kitchen, remembering how much time she had spent in the cramped kitchen of the old house. Ethan had insisted on a separate room for an office, where they could manage the ranch's accounts and records. And they had both insisted on 3 bedrooms upstairs, one for them and two for the children they hoped to have. The barn was finished by July, and Ethan began moving some of the cattle and horses to the new property. It was strange to see life returning to the land where everything had been destroyed, but it was also deeply satisfying. Grace would stand in the yard sometimes, looking at the new house and the new barn, and feel a sense of pride that she had not felt in a long time. In August, Grace realized that she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Ethan. She chose a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch of the new house, watching the sun set over the fields. She took Ethan's hand and placed it on her stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said softly. Ethan's eyes went wide, and then he broke into the biggest smile Grace had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her fiercely, and Grace could feel him trembling with emotion. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice choked. "I am sure," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to be parents, Ethan." Ethan kissed her again, and then he dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against her stomach as if he could already hear the baby's heartbeat. Grace ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed by the depth of her love for this man. A year ago, she had lost everything. Now she had everything she had ever wanted and more. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, and Ethan hovered over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate and rested and did not overwork herself. Grace found it both endearing and exasperating, but she appreciated his concern. She had been so alone after Samuel's death, and now she had a partner who cared about her well-being as much as his own. By the time autumn arrived, Grace was showing, and the whole town knew about the baby. The women in South Pass City threw her a small party, bringing gifts and offering advice. Grace was touched by the generosity, especially from women who had barely spoken to her before. It seemed that her marriage to Ethan had given her a place in the community, a sense of belonging that she had not felt since Samuel's death. Winter came again, and Grace grew larger and more uncomfortable. Ethan fussed over her constantly, building up the fire and making sure she had plenty of blankets and bringing her anything she needed. Grace complained about his overprotectiveness, but secretly she loved it. She had never felt so cherished, so valued. The baby came in early February, during one of the worst snowstorms of the year. The doctor almost did not make it to the ranch in time, but Ethan rode into town through the blizzard and dragged him back, refusing to take no for an answer. Grace labored for 14 hours, and it was the hardest thing she had ever done, but when she finally heard the baby's first cry, everything else faded away. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, placing the tiny, squalling infant in Grace's arms. Grace looked down at her son and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. He had dark hair like Ethan and a determined little face that made her smile even through her exhaustion. Ethan was beside her, tears streaming down his face, and he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered. "Grace, he is perfect." "He is ours," Grace said, and she looked up at Ethan with so much love that it hurt. "We made him together, and he is ours." They named the boy Samuel Ethan Cole, honoring both the past and the present. Ethan had insisted on including Samuel's name, saying that Grace's first husband deserved to be remembered, and Grace had loved him even more for that generosity of spirit. Little Samuel was a healthy, happy baby, with a loud cry and a big appetite. He kept Grace and Ethan busy day and night, but neither of them minded. They took turns walking him when he fussed, and they marveled over every tiny milestone, every smile and coo and grasping hand. As the months passed and Samuel grew, Grace found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been a widow with nothing, standing in the ashes of her old life and wondering how she would survive. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who filled her days with joy, and a home that was truly hers. She had rebuilt not just her ranch, but her entire life. One evening in late summer, when Samuel was 6 months old, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch of their house, watching their son play with a rag doll Grace had made. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Grace leaned against Ethan's shoulder, feeling utterly content. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "The day you found me at the ruins, all the time," Ethan said. "I almost did not ride over. I was busy with work and I told myself the fire was probably under control. But something made me go. I do not know what. Instinct maybe, or fate." "I am glad you listened to it," Grace said. "I do not know what would have happened to me if you had not." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "You would have survived. You are stronger than you know." "Maybe," Grace said, "but I would not have been happy. I would have been alone and struggling and just trying to get by. You gave me more than your ranch and your name, Ethan. You gave me a reason to hope again. You gave me a future." "You gave me the same thing," Ethan said. "I was just existing before you came into my life. Working and sleeping and working some more. But now I have a family, I have love, I have everything I ever wanted." Grace tilted her head back to look at him. "I love you," she said, and it was the easiest thing in the world to say. "I love you so much, Ethan." "I love you too," Ethan said, and he kissed her, sweet and slow, while their son babbled happily at their feet. As the years passed, Grace and Ethan's ranch thrived. They combined their two properties into one large operation, running cattle and horses and growing enough crops to feed their family and sell at market. They hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, and Ethan taught Grace everything he knew about managing livestock and negotiating sales. Grace proved to be a natural businesswoman, with a sharp mind for numbers and a talent for reading people. Together, they made the ranch one of the most successful in the region. They also grew their family. When Samuel was 2 years old, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Emma. Emma had Grace's blonde hair and Ethan's gray eyes, and she was a spitfire from the moment she was born. 2 years after Emma came another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful like his father. And 2 years after James came the youngest, a girl they named Lily, who had a laugh that could brighten even the darkest day. The house that had once seemed so big was now filled to bursting with noise and chaos and love. Grace and Ethan navigated the challenges of raising 4 children with patience and humor, supporting each other through sleepless nights and childhood illnesses, and the everyday struggles of parenthood. They made sure to teach their children the value of hard work and kindness, and they told them stories about the past so they would understand how far their family had come. Samuel, their eldest, grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. He would follow Ethan around the property, asking questions and learning everything he could about running the operation. Grace knew that one day, Samuel would take over the ranch, and the thought filled her with pride. Emma was wild and fearless, always climbing trees and chasing after the ranch hands and getting into trouble. She reminded Grace of herself at that age, full of energy and curiosity and determination. Ethan said that Emma would either run the ranch alongside her brother or run off and have grand adventures, and Grace suspected he was right. James was the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over conflicts between his siblings and make sure everyone was happy. He had a gentle soul and a love of books, and Grace often found him reading in quiet corners of the house. She thought he might become a teacher or a preacher, something that would let him use his intelligence and his compassion. And Lily, the baby, was everyone's favorite. She had a way of wrapping people around her little finger, and she knew it. She was spoiled by her older siblings and her parents in equal measure, but she was also kind and generous, always sharing her toys and giving hugs when someone was sad. Grace watched her children grow and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had built. She still thought about Samuel Nichols sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when she was alone with her thoughts. She wondered what he would think of her now, of the family she had created with another man. She hoped he would be happy for her. She hoped he would understand that moving on did not mean forgetting. One afternoon in late autumn, when Grace was in her early 30s and the children were playing in the yard, Ethan found her standing by the creek, looking at the spot where the old house had once stood. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The past," Grace said, "and the future, and how strange life is, the way it takes us to places we never expected to go." "Do you have regrets?" Ethan asked quietly. Grace turned in his arms so she could look at him. His hair was graying at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still the same steady, kind man who had offered her his hand when she had nothing. "No," she said firmly, "I do not have regrets. I am grateful for everything, even the hard parts, because all of it, the joy and the pain, brought me to you, and I would not trade what we have for anything in the world." Ethan smiled and kissed her, and Grace closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of his love, solid and real and enduring. As the sun began to set, they walked back to the house together, hand in hand. Their children ran to meet them, laughing and shouting about some game they had been playing, and Grace scooped up Lily and swung her around while Ethan ruffled James's hair. They went inside together, the whole family, and sat down to dinner around the big table Ethan had built when Emma was born. Grace looked around at her family, at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, and felt a profound sense of peace. This was her life now. This was her home. And it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and blessings. There were hard winters and dry summers, illnesses and injuries, disagreements and moments of doubt. But through it all, Grace and Ethan stood together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. They faced every obstacle as a team, and they celebrated every victory as a family. When Grace turned 40, Ethan threw her a party at the ranch, inviting everyone they knew from South Pass City and the surrounding area. It was a warm summer evening, and the yard was filled with people eating and drinking and dancing to the music of a fiddler Ethan had hired for the occasion. Grace wore a new dress that Ethan had bought for her in town, and she felt beautiful and loved and completely content. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Ethan pulled Grace aside and led her away from the house, toward the spot where the old house had burned so many years ago. Grace was surprised to see that he had set up a blanket and a lantern there, creating a little oasis of light in the darkness. "What is this?" she asked, smiling. "I wanted to give you a gift," Ethan said. "Something to mark this day and everything we have built together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Grace took it, her hands trembling slightly, and opened it. It was a deed, transferring full ownership of both properties to her name. "Ethan, I do not understand," Grace said, looking up at him. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve it," Ethan said simply. "When we married, I told you I was giving you my ranch and my name. But the truth is, Grace, you gave me so much more. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to live. You turned this place from a lonely house into a home. So I want you to have it, officially and legally. I want you to know that this land is yours, that no one can ever take it from you. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Ethan's neck and held him tight, overwhelmed by the depth of his love and generosity. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything, Ethan. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for letting me," Ethan said, and he kissed her, slow and deep, while the lantern flickered beside them and the stars shone overhead. They stayed there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the past and the future and all the moments in between. Grace thought about the woman she had been, standing in the ruins of her old life, broken and alone. And she thought about the woman she was now, strong and loved and surrounded by family. The journey from one to the other had been long and painful, but it had been worth every step. As they finally stood and walked back to the house, Grace looked up at the sky and silently thanked whatever force had brought Ethan to her that day. Fate, instinct, divine intervention, it did not matter. What mattered was that they had found each other, and they had built something beautiful together. The children were waiting for them on the porch when they returned. Samuel, now a teenager, was holding Lily, who had fallen asleep in his arms. Emma and James were sitting on the steps, tired but happy from the long day of celebration. They all looked up when Grace and Ethan approached, and Grace felt her heart swell with love. "Come on," she said, smiling. "Let us get everyone to bed." They went inside together, the whole family, and Grace tucked each of her children in, kissing their foreheads and whispering that she loved them. Then she and Ethan went to their own room and lay down together, exhausted but content. "Happy birthday, Grace," Ethan murmured, pulling her close. "It has been a perfect day," Grace said. "Thank you for making it so special." "Every day with you is special," Ethan said, and Grace smiled in the darkness. She fell asleep in his arms, feeling safe and loved and completely at peace. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ranch continued to prosper over the years, becoming one of the most respected operations in Wyoming. Grace and Ethan's children grew into capable, kind adults who carried on the values their parents had taught them. Samuel eventually took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, with Emma as his partner. James went to college in the East and became a teacher, though he returned home every summer to help with the ranch work. And Lily married a young rancher from a neighboring property, staying close to her family and starting a family of her own. Grace and Ethan became grandparents and then great-grandparents, and they watched their family tree grow and flourish with pride and joy. They grew old together, their hair turning white and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by decades of partnership and devotion. On a warm spring evening when Grace was 68 and Ethan was 72, they sat together on the porch of the house they had built so many years ago. The sun was setting, and the fields were green and lush, dotted with cattle and horses. Their great-grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter ringing through the air. Grace reached over and took Ethan's hand, and he squeezed her fingers gently. "You remember the day we met?" she asked. "Of course," Ethan said. "I rode over the ridge and saw you standing there, covered in soot and looking like your world had ended. I knew right then that I was going to help you. I just did not know how much you were going to change my life." "I was so lost," Grace said quietly. "I did not know how I was going to survive. And then you came along and gave me everything. Your home, your name, your love. You gave me a reason to keep going." "You did the same for me," Ethan said. "I was just going through the motions before you, working myself to exhaustion every day because I did not have anything else. But you made me want more. You made me want a life, not just an existence." Grace smiled. "We saved each other, I think." "I think you are right," Ethan agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. Then Grace said, "I want you to know that I have been happy, Ethan. Truly, deeply happy. I know my life did not turn out the way I first planned, but I would not change a single thing. Because it all led me to you and to this beautiful family we created together." Ethan's eyes were bright with tears. "I feel the same way. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Cole. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I will love you," Grace said, "always and forever." They kissed, slow and tender, and then they turned their attention back to the yard where their great-grandchildren were playing. Grace felt a profound sense of completion, like every piece of her life had fallen into place exactly as it was meant to. She thought about the fire that had taken everything from her all those years ago. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. But now she understood that it had been a beginning. A chance to start over, to build something new, to find a love that was deeper and truer than anything she had known before. The fire had destroyed her old life, but it had cleared the way for a new one. And that new life, built on ashes and hope and the generosity of a cowboy who had given her his ranch and his name, had been more beautiful than she ever could have imagined. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling utterly content. She had lost everything once, but she had gained so much more. She had a husband who cherished her, children and grandchildren who loved her, and a legacy that would endure for generations. She had survived the fire, and she had built a life worth living. And that, Grace thought, was the greatest gift of all. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, and together they watched the night settle over the ranch, their ranch, the home they had built from nothing but determination and love. The crickets began to sing, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and Grace felt the peace that comes from a life well lived. In the distance, she could hear their great-grandchildren calling good night, and she smiled. The future was bright, filled with promise and possibility. The Cole family would continue to thrive, carrying on the values and the love that she and Ethan had worked so hard to instill. And as Grace sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by everything she held dear, she knew that she had found what so many people search for their entire lives. She had found a home, a family, and a love that would last forever. The widow who had lost everything in a fire had become a woman who had everything she needed, all because a kind cowboy had seen her pain and offered her his hand. It was a story worth telling, a life worth living, and a love worth cherishing. And Grace would carry that love with her, always and forever, until her very last breath.